Our debate for tonight is terrorism is overemphasized as a security threat. I am going to call upon our Prime Minister, Adrian, to come up and start to define the motion and put together the arguments for the government. Adrian?
Madam Speaker, ladies and gentlemen of the House, the resolution before us today, terrorism is overemphasized as a security threat. The resolution is defined as follows. Terrorism, the use of violence and threats to intimidate or coerce for political purposes, is overemphasized, is given excessive attention as a security threat, as a danger to North America's political and social order. According to the Think by Numbers website, anti-terrorism spending is 50,000 times more on any other cause of death in North America. While terrorism is a concern, the government believes that there are dangers to North America's political and social order, which by comparison are not given as much attention considering the danger's effects. The government will argue that there are three major dangers to the political and social order of North America that are eclipsed by the excessive attention given to terrorism. The first danger is inadequate or non-existent infrastructure and emergency preparedness. The second danger is economic disparity. And the third danger is the side effects of climate change, which will be discussed by the government seconder. Most of us have seen or remember the disaster spawned by Hurricane Katrina that happened in New Orleans. In 2006, on the report of the disaster, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers stated that faulty design specifications, incomplete sections, and substandard construction of levees contributed to the damage done by Hurricane Katrina. A report by the American Civil Engineers in June 2007 concluded that 2/3 of the flooding in the city that could have been avoided if the levees had held. The result of this hurricane was widespread looting, crime, a complete breakdown in social order, as seen by the people living in the Superdome, and riots, looting, and the inability of local and state authorities to maintain order. There were reports of police officers fleeing their post, and one town opposite New Orleans, across a bridge from the city, actually refused refugees coming from that city by gunpoint. Another example, hypothetical example, but one which is still very important. Vancouver is due for a 9+ earthquake on the Richter scale, which would have the ability to completely level the city. According to the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation, they estimate that up to 30% of wood frame homes, between 50 and 100% of brick buildings, 30% of low and medium-rise buildings, and 20% of high-rise buildings will be completely destroyed. The government argues that natural events such as these and the lack of infrastructure we have to prevent or even mitigate these disasters is just as much as a threat to Canada's or North America's political and social order. For example, in the British Columbia example, billions and billions of dollars would be flowing into rebuilding. Increased taxes, increased deficits, increased debt, ecological disaster from ruptured pipelines, widespread disrespect for the laws, overstressed armed and police forces, fire and EMS, for example. Resentment from other parts of the country going without because of everything that has to go to rebuild BC and rebuild Vancouver, for example. And not just for 1 or 2 years, but for 10 years or even decades. These examples are something which would have more effect and which would affect more the social and political order that North America faces, or in this particular case Canada would face, than any one terrorist attack. Now, the government isn't saying that money spent on terrorism can be used to prevent natural disasters. However, when one compares the amount of money spent on terrorism compared to the money spent to mitigate these disasters, the comparison is clear. For example, the Department of Homeland Security in the States has spent over $600 billion fighting terrorism. $600 billion over the last 10 years. And this is according to their own website. However, the agency responsible for dealing with events such as hurricanes, natural disasters, earthquakes, wildfires, events which happen every single year and which are almost guaranteed to happen every single year, only received 17% of that money. And that agency would be FEMA. And furthermore, out of that money, the actual programs used to help mitigate these disasters was only for 2011 $2.1 billion. So out of the $600 billion that was spent, 17% is only going to natural events that have the ability to cause more life, more loss of life, more property damage, and more disruption to the social and political order than a politically instigated act of terror. And only 3% is actually going to the infrastructure and resources to prevent these natural disasters from crippling wide swaths of our country and becoming a real threat to the current social and political order. Things like, for example, retrofitted structures, more money and more grants given to fire departments, police, and emergency services, making our communication systems more redundant and flexible, better equipment, increased research grants, better funded scientists, increased warning systems, better constructed and more redundant power supplies can all help reduce the loss of life and property damage that will dwarf any terrorist attack that has been leveled against North America. And yet, because these aren't seen as sexy, or more importantly, they're not seen as deliberate acts, they're given short shrift in the analysis of security threats, even though they have the ability to destabilize the political and social order we come to expect and are used to living in. Instead, the priority of governments in the past have been to shake Granny down at customs because she might be carrying a bomb. According to the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, income for middle-class Canadians have remained stagnant since the 1980s. And this is my second argument, the economic argument. While the rich can park their savings in financial markets, everyone else falls deeper into debt. British researchers Wilkinson and Pickett, for example, have found that obesity, mental illness, homicides, teenage birth rates, incarcerations, child conflict, number of patents issued, life expectancy, and educational performance all are worse in places with higher income inequality. We are raising a generation of students and young people aged 15 to 29 who are unemployed. 13% are unemployed in Canada, according to StatsCan, May 2012. This lost generation are without jobs, and they are protesting and they are demonstrating. Canada has spent the last 10 years spending $98 billion on security, and we feel that it should be better spent on these other issues which have a greater potential to destabilize North America's social and political culture. For all these reasons, the government begs to propose.
Thank you very much, Adrian. I would now like to ask David to come to the podium and deliver the arguments for the opposition.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Well, ladies and gentlemen, you have heard the government's position, and they seem to be saying that because our roads and bridges are crumbling, because of our aquifers and sewer systems are crumbling, that we should focus on these things instead of looking after or trying to counter any kind of threat from other quarters, either domestic or foreign. And you're probably wondering, as I was, exactly what the government's point is here, because one does not seem to be related to the other. Certainly we have expenses with regard to our infrastructure. That's one set of arguments. How that infrastructure poses any threat to the political and social order is beyond me. It seems to me that we have greater threats from terrorist groups, either foreign or domestic. In any case, the government does not give any reasons for security. They don't tell us these reasons. When they search at airports, for example, they may not necessarily be looking for weapons. They may not be necessarily looking for anything at all. Perhaps they're just seeking contraband. Maybe they're trying to uncover drugs, perhaps some kind of small weapons. Reasons are not given. So, in the government's case, they are proposing that the reasons have been given, the threat to the political and social order. There's no such thing in whatever code that they use. And it may be nothing more than the fact that security agencies investigate because that's what they do. You know, the cops snoop because cops like to snoop. That's what they do. Herbert Hoover, for example, ran through 50 years of service and 8 presidents, because he had a bunch of people out there snooping, and he had more on them than they had on him. That's what snoops do. To a kid with a hammer, the whole world is a nail. So it's as simple as that in many cases. I'd like to point out the fact that security is not simply something that goes on at airports, for example. I'm talking about security in terms of the fact that it comes from the state imposed upon the citizenry. Here's where money gets spent. He mentioned some $600 billion. I really question those figures. We know now that any large industrial state keeps wiretaps on its citizens. It searches them through the social media. It goes through work records. It goes through financial records. We are getting into the point now where the human genome is being mapped, so it's possible to sequence DNA and identify people in their activities. And we have also seen where the state is using these methods increasingly so to the point where civil liberties are threatened. We have seen where elections have been stolen in the U.S., George Bush in 2002, and again in 2000 and again in 2004. We have seen Vladimir Putin steal elections in Russia. We have seen elections being stolen in China. The state is very much now the agency of terrorism. We have state terrorism being imposed from above. And that indeed is a very, very disturbing thought. In response to that, how does the poor man pit himself against the rich? Terrorism has been said to be the poor man's war. We don't fight in mass formations anymore, so the man in the street has to take on a government. If he's sufficiently deluded or sick, he may be a suicide bomber. Right now, suicides, they take place in movie theaters and postal stations and so forth. But if the security was relaxed at airports, they would go on, because that would be indeed a coup de grace to take down a major airliner. We haven't seen it in recent years. That's probably because security is strong enough to overcome it. So who is to say, for example, that the threat is no longer there? It certainly is. But to speak about income inequality, for example, that the expansion of the underprivileged class, of the obesity and the disease and the lack of education and so forth, to say that these pose a threat in the same sense of a security threat is to mislead the audience. There is nothing here that suggests an attack upon the fundamental structure of the state. There is nothing here to suggest a threat to the social or the political order. Crumbling infrastructure is something that societies must maintain anyway. They must treat. It's got nothing at all really to do with security. To say that we have to shift the emphasis from one to the other is to mix up 2 points here completely. So we are seeing also a rise in the amount of miniaturization that goes on in the things that people bring through airports. The security has to be more and more invasive because the culprits are ever more cunning and able in their means. So to say that we can mix up the whole idea of bridges and roads and so forth with threats to the social order is simply to talk apples and oranges here. I beg you to defeat the motion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. I would now like to call on the member of the opposition, Heather, to support the government.
Ladies and gentlemen, Honorable Prime Minister, members of the opposition, what we have here is a discussion about the overemphasis of terrorism as a security threat, and the fact that excessive spending on this security threat is actually endangering the lives of fellow citizens because someone's got to pay for the security implementation that is being overinflated and justified by striking the fear in the hearts of Canadians and people across North America. What it is tantamount to, ladies and gentlemen, is a form of terrorism in itself, because what it does is it reallocates money from the government, which owns nothing, that's supposed to go to programs that help all Canadians, and it funnels through to a few fat cats who are running the companies to sell all the fancy equipment to people to make us think that we're safer than we were. I would argue, ladies and gentlemen, what we're missing in our anti-terrorism security measures in this country, what we're missing and what the opposition was missing in their argument, ladies and gentlemen, is common sense. There had been Senate committee reports. There was John Major, the Supreme Justice, came out with a report on Air India, which, by the way, happened in 1985, prior to 9/11. What he has discerned in 2010, 25 years after Air India, was the weakest link for our security in Canada were the folks behind the scene who are fueling the plane, who are cleaning the cabin, who are putting your catering on board, who are checking your seats before you get on. The people that were doing this apparently had the breach in Montreal that led to the worst domestic terror attack in Canadian history. And why, ladies and gentlemen? Because the people working there were making minimum wage. And now, in 2001, we had exactly the same problem. In 2010, he argued, we have exactly the same problem. After $98 billion of investing in security in our country and the United States spending $1 trillion, we still have all the people behind the scenes making minimum wage. Airport security screeners on average make $13 an hour or $30,000 a year. But do you know how much the fat cats make who own the companies that sell the equipment? I'll tell you what they make. There's a company called L3. We have just bought a bunch of security scanners, I believe 47 security scanners at $250,000 a pop. So the government invested $14 million to check your naked bodies, to do a virtual strip search. We have metal detectors. You take your shoes off, you take your belts off, you go through the machines. They have some kind of alarm that goes off that they can detect chemicals that create bombs. So this machinery cost $14 million. The guy who runs the company made $13 million last year. It's a Fortune 500 company. The people who are using the equipment make $30,000 a year. Here's what the track record of the equipment is. There have been radiation burns. It has caused sickness. The equipment is manufactured in China. So the U.S. company that we purchased this equipment from is just a middleman from China. What happens is they sell it to the government, and the government thinks they've had independent testing. So when they get the reports on this equipment, they go, oh, below minimum standards for radiation, check, 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 we'll buy them. If you look into who's doing the testing, it's actually a firm in California that is funded by the company, L3 Communications, to show that this equipment is not dangerous. Did Health Canada do any independent testing? No. So what happens, these get put in the airports, a whole slew of them go to Atlantic Canada. CATSA, which has a $1.5 billion budget, is asking the government for more money for their security. And what they had to do was they had to cut 140 jobs of those minimum wage earners at a savings of $1.4 million so they could buy this $14 million worth of equipment. But guess what happened when they laid off 140 people? There was no one to work the equipment. So the equipment's sitting dormant. So I would argue that the money we're spending on this ridiculous equipment to make fat cats and a CEO who made $11 million for doing absolutely nothing is coming away from mental health programs. 3,900 suicides a year in Canada, that's equivalent to a 9/11 every year. 350 of those are teenagers. That's a jetliner going down every year that could be used. We could mitigate that. We could spend money on drought, fire prevention, any number of emergency preparedness measures, but we decided to do this. And ladies and gentlemen, at the end of the day, are we any safer than we were in 9/11? Maybe a little bit. Are we safe enough that the risk has been mitigated by the amount of investment? Certainly not. So I would argue that every terrorist that has been found, none have been perpetrated on Canadian soil since 9/11. They've all been found out by human intelligence, fellow passengers who saw something suspicious. So ladies and gentlemen, common sense is the solution to the terrorist threat in our country, not all the common dollars that are funneling from the government from programs that belong to the people. I rest my case.
Thank you very much, Heather. I would now like to ask Dean to come up and finalize the arguments on behalf of the opposition.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Well, folks, would you buy a scanner from that woman? I'll tell you, she's got the sales pitch for you right there. Ladies and gentlemen, the issue before you and us in the House this evening is that terrorism is overemphasized as a security threat, and we do not believe this is the case. A quote attributed to Thomas Jefferson says, "Eternal vigilance is the price of liberty." Ladies and gentlemen, post 9/11, we're all aware of it. Pre-9/11, well, are we sure? Do we know? Terrorism has been going on for centuries. Guy Fawkes in England was a terrorist. He threatened to blow up Parliament. Well, ladies and gentlemen, they happened to save Parliament at the time. The Ku Klux Klan is considered a terrorist group. They kill people, they hurt people, they intimidate people, they intimidate them to get their political ends met through fear. Ladies and gentlemen, are we safe enough? The seconder for the government asks. Well, ladies and gentlemen, let me ask you. You buy insurance for your home, your car, your life, and you think, wow, that's expensive. Is it enough? And when Hurricane Leslie flows through Truro and people have to recover their house and their goods, many of them who bought insurance are saying, no, it wasn't enough, but it's at least something. And it's something that gets us on our feet. Now, terrorism is what we are concerned about today because the threat is real. The government will have you believe that scanner salesmen or scanner company owners with their government buddies are trying to sell you a bill of goods because they want to sell their big expensive machine. Well, that's one way of doing it, indeed, and it may not be the best way of doing it. We would argue that humans are great at perceiving quirks and funny situations. The shoe bomber and the underwear bomber on the planes recently were uncovered by people in the planes before the planes took off, outside the planes, because there was something odd about them. And no, they didn't work. They had faulty equipment, fortunately. But ladies and gentlemen, terrorism is not overemphasized. We have an actual threat. 9/11 is the result of that threat. Timothy McVeigh and the Oklahoma City bombing in the United States is a terrorist threat. One man, perhaps connected to others, perhaps not mentally stable, but nonetheless trying to disrupt the social and political order because of a particular way of looking at the world. Now, you can't stop everything. No. If you decide tomorrow to go and shoot people in the Eden Center, unless you tell somebody, nobody will know that. So there will be those situations. But it has been proven that to be vigilant, the FBI, the CIA, the police forces, and the like, is to be prepared to address potential terrorist situations. Now, we've talked about airports, and as I say, there are other situations that happen that are being monitored. The government is monitoring telephone conversations, and it might be yours, it might be somebody else's. If you're not a threat, they probably won't care about you. If you are a threat, then they probably will. The $600 billion spent by FEMA, indeed, that was probably overkill. But that wasn't the amount of money that was the issue, it was how it was dispersed. And the politics and the public image of the federal government and looking good in the form of disaster. What we need to do is to properly direct the terrorism, the anti-terrorism money, whether it's against the Ku Klux Klan, whether it's against potential germ warfare that has been discussed, nuclear bombs. Nonetheless, bombs in any case. We're not talking about North America when we talk about Pakistan, but there's nothing to say that some suicide bomber couldn't show up and blow up a bank, a church, a mosque, a synagogue, who knows. But the vigilance of the society and being aware of what's around, we tend to lose that in the larger cities, and we need to be more vigilant. It is not overemphasized terrorism as a security threat. It's a real threat, and it has real consequences. Ladies and gentlemen, we must stay prepared.
Thank you very much, Dean. I would now like to call on David to come up and summarize the case for the opposition.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The government has said that that the track record on safety is not very good, that we're not really very good at securing ourselves against terrorist attack. Well, the fat cats that they mentioned, they seem to do a rather good job of it. They live in gated communities. They in Iraq, for example, they live in a green zone. They have bunkers for the officials and the politicians and so forth. So it seems to be a question of who gets protected, but certainly the technology and the means of bringing that protection about is quite well known. So it's a little specious to say that we are just simply unable to do that. She went on to say, the member of the government, that the terrorists are not effective, that they brought down an airliner or two, and in the long run it doesn't amount to much. Well, if you look at warfare, and I will for a moment take it off North American soil, the war in Iraq was won by the Iraqis, in Afghan by the Afghanis. And what were they using? Improvised explosive devices, Coca-Cola cans filled with pebbles. So it doesn't take much for a terrorist to be very, very effective. And as my colleague mentioned, eternal vigilance is the only way to counteract that. They also made the point that the $600 billion could have been better spent, at least in terms of national security, to combat such things as obesity and pollution and toxic waste and so forth. Well, if we really wanted to hit these things, we'd have to hit the very same fat cats. If we want to do something about obesity, we have to hit the fast food joints. If we want to do something about pollution, we have to hit the car manufacturers. We have to bring in the legislation with teeth in it. We haven't done that. We want to hit toxic mortgages and destitution and poverty. Same thing, we'd have to hit the Wall Street firms. If we want to do something about the cancers, we'd have to hit the tobacco manufacturers. According to the government, all of these things can be simply explained away by shifting our emphasis away from the support of the elites. Well, in fact, the kind of social progress they're speaking about will only be done if the elites are worked with in some way. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. I would now like to call upon Adrian to summarize the arguments for the government.
Madam Speaker, ladies and gentlemen of the House, the resolution before us today was that terrorism was given excessive attention. Excessive attention. That means the government is not saying to ignore terrorism completely, as the opposition have led you to believe. What we are saying is that there are other, more pressing concerns which have, or will have, the same effect as a terrorist attack. While the government appreciates that terrorism is a threat, as we just mentioned, the danger to political and social order is not as great as the danger posed by an increasingly sick or aged population, for example, or a generation of young people out of work. or a society with greater income inequality, and because their income increasingly weakened financially, it provides all the detriments that the government has already mentioned, or a society unable to mitigate the natural disasters because of poor infrastructure. Just today, for example, Hurricane Leslie breached some dikes in Nova Scotia because the dikes were too old. This is what we're talking about. These are all the things that have the potential, if on a wide scale, to cause political and social order to be weakened. The government believes that paying attention to little old ladies and toddlers on the off chance that they may be carrying bombs in their purse or in their bottle of milk is not as great a threat to the political and social order of North America as the other issues that we have mentioned. For all of these reasons, we beg the House to support the resolution and to support civilization as we know it.
Thank you very much, Adrian. I would like now to call on David to do the adjudication for tonight's debate and to announce the winner.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Well, this was a great start to the season. I'm very happy that we started with an excellent debate. This debate was very broad in scope. I was very happy with where both teams went with their arguments and their content. It really kind of opened the debate, and it was excellent to watch that growth develop. So I'll say that at first. I'm going to talk about the 5 different elements of this debate. First of all, I would like to talk about the argument. On the government side, with Adrian and Heather. And Adrian, in the beginning, immediately came out with his argument saying 1, 2, 3, and even said that number 3 will be dealt with by his partner. And so already I'm thinking this is going to be great points. It's nicely laid out for me. And then, unfortunately, in the Prime Minister's speech, the Prime Minister gets to one point and then partially develops a second point and then runs out of time, because I thought that the argument was a little bit weaker because of that. And then actually over to the seconder for the government side. The seconder for the government didn't actually touch on the point that the Prime Minister mentioned that she would. So it almost felt like the bottom fell out of that wonderful organization, which was a shame. But otherwise, I found that the arguments were clear and relevant, and so they were well put together. So that was good, and there was definitely no problem finding out where your arguments were. But it was really undercut, and actually you'll see that when I get to the teamwork point here. Going over to the opposition side, I found the arguments were a bit more disorganized. It was a little bit hard to distinguish. I really appreciate the here's point 1, point 2, so it was kind of just a stream of consciousness coming from the opposition side. However, what I did hear was very strong and compelling. So it wasn't a total loss for arguments there. In terms of arguments, the government won it on those sides here. For just the argument, the government took that side. For content, again, everyone brought in a lot of content. There was a lot of depth here, lots of examples, evidence from the Civil Engineering Corps, what damage in Vancouver would cost from, I think it was a mortgage corporation, John Major, Air India, the Russian election, Guy Fawkes, KKK, Oklahoma City bombing, Eaton Center, everywhere. Lots of examples. It was very close, but again, the government kind of won on the content section there, but it was very strong. Rebuttal and refutation. This is where the crux of the debate actually came from, because, as you know, the Prime Minister didn't have a chance to rebut officially. So all of the rebuttal fell to the government seconder. And actually, the government seconder, I thought, missed almost everything that the Leader of the Opposition said. I actually didn't really hear any strong rebuttals. It all felt like it was all the prepared routine of the debate, which was great for argument points. A lot of score there, as you've heard. Unfortunately, I heard a lot of things from the Leader of the Opposition about state terrorism. What is the point? Give me what are the reasons why it's not just that other things are worse, but why terrorism is still a really important thing, and I didn't hear that engagement of the debate. That was really missing. So that was actually a big setback for the government side. Opposition side, however, was listening. Opposition, especially Dean, who came in there talking about the shoe bomber, that was undercut by people. People found that within direct in direct engagement to Heather's point about the equipment was gotten rid of and then people can't run the equipment, and then about FEMA also attacking the points that the government brought up, but then talking about, well, it was how that money was spent, not exactly. It was all about political posturing. So for the for teamwork, that is definitely. Oh, sorry. For rebuttal and refutation, the opposition took a clear lead on that one. For teamwork, as I was mentioning a little earlier, the government had the opportunity to really score some serious teamwork points, especially in comparison to the opposition, and the bottom fell out and it was dropped. So it was almost worse if you hadn't said that would happen. And I was wondering what would happen in the summation. And so that's kind of where that lies. The opposition side, the teamwork felt a little stronger in comparison, I think. So it's just the strong comparison, where I thought the argument growth was partially shared by the two members of the opposition parties. To style and rhetoric, I thought everyone had a great evening tonight. Some of the things I'd like to point out, I loved Heather's presentation. It was very strong, very compelling. A sales pitch, which Dean characterized it as, which I thought was a great style point for him. David, with your comment about terrorism being a poor man's war, it's very compelling rhetoric. And Adrian talking about Granny at the airport, you did that a couple of times. And your final summation, vote for civilization, vote for the government. That was very neat. So very, very strong there. The only thing I would say as a bit of a constructive point is that in the very beginning of your speech, probably because we haven't done this since all summer, it was a little quick. I was having a bit of difficulty catching up to you, and I wasn't quite sure what you were saying at times, but you smoothed it out. So that was the only thing I would say for style there. A few other things I'd like to mention. Argument side for the Prime Minister, I can't really picture all of Canada resenting Vancouver if Vancouver suffers a magnitude 9 earthquake. I didn't see that happen. I'm not sure, but the problem is it wasn't supported, and it didn't resonate with me, so that's just the thing I meant there. Dean, another thing I'd like to point out from you, something that was interesting overall is I found both sides would sometimes say the same thing, but differently. We heard from the opposition about we've got state-sponsored terrorism now, and then we heard the seconder for the government say all of the spending to prevent terrorism is state-sponsored terrorism. That was really neat, and I wish the debaters themselves would talk about that. And even the Prime Minister, going back to the Prime Minister talking about harassing Granny at the airport checkpoints, we also had Dean who said, quote, if you aren't a threat, they probably won't care about you, which is a great characterization of airport security. So I thought that was wonderful. So finally, the numbers, I put the numbers together, and the government is going to want to improve their rebuttal and refutation next time, because that was entirely borne by the seconder for the government. And Adrian, I could not count any of your rebuttals during your summation. Oh, pardon me. Actually, that actually is a criticism of the leader of the opposition. You had a final rebuttal as opposed to a final summation. I really wanted to hear that. That would bolster your argument points. So the final totals, the government won the government won 38 points, but the opposition won the debate with a total of 52 points. So the motion is defeated, and the best speaker is Dean. So David. Either or.
Thank you very much, sir.
Congratulations.
That's very good. Thank you.
Madam Speaker.
So we have the results of the popular vote, and Margie, can you tell us?
Popular vote disagreed with the adjudicator and suggested that the government won 11-6.
So, Adrian, please come up. Oh, take it this end. Congratulations.
And I would like to thank Anita for her work tonight as speaker. I really appreciate it, especially your ability to contain people running over. That was a good.